Blood of Dragons, Volume 2, Hangovers and Hay. Chapter 1, Sophia. Through the darkness and the mead-soaked dreams there was a scuffing and movement, a sense of proximity on the very edge of her senses, but one easy enough to ignore. It was warm and cosy, and the very last thing Sophia wanted to do was let sleep's grip on her mind loosen, but the sudden clattering and an impact of cushioned yet unyielding mass into her legs had other plans. Even if she hadn't spent the night drinking until she had inevitably blacked out, getting woken up early in the morning was not something she enjoyed in the slightest. After all, Sophia's opinions on such matters was that the best kind of mornings were the ones you slept through, or, at the very least, spent sleeping with someone, and not have what felt like a sack filled with Dwemer scrap metal landing on your legs. It was rude, and despite the way her brain seemed to physically slosh about inside her skull, she twisted, poking her head out from the blanket, and immediately wished that she didn't make the attempt. Mead was wonderful, and White Run was famed for the several breweries of the honey alcohol, but it certainly didn't help when you had drunk enough only a few hours previously that you smelled like it. It was even worse when the moment her face exited the protective covering of the horse blanket, it was assaulted by the overwhelming smell of hay, horse piss, and her own mead sweat. The light wasn't any better, especially by the fact that by the way that a finger of light, streaming through an open door, appeared as though the sun had a personal vendetta against her. For several moments she managed to do nothing more than grimace, crush her eyes closed, and attempt not to waste several dozen copper septims worth of alcohol by adding it to the mess already occupying the stable floor. What? Where am I? As usual, it appeared that the night before had resulted in her waking to the taste of mead clinging to her tongue like a mouthful of tundra cotton. But this time it wasn't a gutter or a haystack, at least. Unfortunately, at the same time, it also wasn't a bed that belonged to the latest stranger who gained her attention either, but the stables were a nice middle ground between the two. Standing just outside of the stall that she had claimed during the night, a figure stood framed in the beams of light and the dancing dust motes and straw dust that floated in the air. For a brief moment she wondered whether she did in fact spend the night literally rolling in the hay with yet another stranger, but through the alcohol haze and the threats of a hangover, she could see signs that this wasn't the case. A travelling bag, cloak, and various other items rested on the other side of the railings, and even in her current state it was obvious that, no, she hadn't spent the night wrapped around someone. This time, at least. "Oh, it's you." Muscles stiffened as though struck by a bolt of lightning magicka, and it was near impossible not to see the way that the figure reacted to her words with suspicion and wariness. "Excuse me?" Back straight, shoulders tensed, and a voice that was harsh and clipped, Sophia struggled to get a better look at the person who had inadvertently woken her from her mead-soaked dreams. He looked familiar, initially at least, but the blurriness and beams of light poking her brain with claw-tipped fingers via her pupils didn't help. The more she managed to see, though, the more that her assumptions were proven false. He was not one of the stable hands, the stable's owner, or even one of the White Run city guards come to arrest her for vagrancy. Again, he was a stranger, a traveller, or one of the tens of thousands of people living in the city, and despite herself she felt a twinge of awkwardness as he turned to face her. What? A small collection of pouches on a harness had been the object that had fallen on her, dislodged from where it had been hanging over the top rail separating the stalls that they had chosen to spend the night. Like many of the businesses within Skyrim, the White Run stables was slowly failing, its trade fading and withering as the Stormcloak Rebellion bled commerce dry, and most of the stalls were practically empty. Few horses remained in any of them, and like her, the stranger appeared to have sought out the first unoccupied one to rest for the night. "Have we met?" Even through the mead haze, Sophia could detect the wariness of his tone and the subtle hints of threat within the words, but it didn't matter to her. Being threatened was a daily, if not hourly, occurrence of the way that she chose to live her life, let alone the wider state Skyrim was in at the moment. So instead she ignored it, even as he stepped into her stall to collect his fallen items. No, Sophia said truthfully, looking up from her position on the piled hay at the end of the stall under her acquired horse blanket. I've never seen you before. It was the truth, at least, the certainty growing stronger as she took the moment to study him. There was nothing that put him apart from the hundreds, if not more, travellers and adventurers that roamed between the holds and their capital cities. Worn leather, threadbare cloth, and ragged straps and belts clung to his body, and over the ragged clothes he had been in the process of shrugging on a battered iron breastplate when his harness had fallen and woken her up. The armour especially had seen better years, perhaps even decades, but appeared to match its wearer at least. Thick stubble clung to his jaw, a mouth unaccustomed to smiling framed in a goatee, hair hacked rather than cut short, and a pair of brown eyes that held no amusement or any real emotion at all. So you don't know who I am? The jingling of metal and other smaller items made itself heard as he lifted the collection of pouches attached to a thick leather belt from her feet, and the stare he gave her made her feel as though she was faced by an ice wolf. There was still a tenseness, but strangely he seemed to relax at her admission. I have no idea who you are. There are a lot of people in Whiterun, and it's not like I've been stalking you or anything. A momentary pause, a slight rise of an eyebrow at her words, and a half-smile was all that she got in response, as he stepped back and rummaged through some of the pouches. She caught glimpses of a varied collection of items. A water skin, mostly empty by the way it practically flopped about, a whetstone and chipped skinning dagger, some travelling rations of hardtack and salted meats wrapped in muslin, and her experienced ear heard the clink of a literal handful of coins that she estimated to be barely enough to purchase breakfast. Unlike her, it seemed that his choice of lodgings for the evening was not as a result of intoxicated decisions, but of poverty, or at least a lack of funds. Some sort of traveller or adventurer for sure, she thought to herself, seeing the way he moved with practised ease and catching glimpses of further possessions of someone who travelled frequently and far. Everything he appeared to own was either in poor condition or exceptionally cheap and crude and little more than scrap. But there was something that definitely caught her attention. His sword. Everything else would have been lucky enough to gain him a handful of silver septims in total, but the lengthy bastard sword that rattled in its scabbard as he moved was a different matter. It was easily worth 20, maybe even 30 gold septims, and was exceptionally cared for. Besides the blackened scorch marks from being too close to a fire that unnervingly marked the leather scabbard at least. I hope you had a good morning, and I'm sorry for disturbing you, but I have to go now, he said, sparing her a glance and turning for the door. Looking him over and studying his equipment and clothing with a practised eye had done more than allow her to identify the lack of potential acquisitions as were her habit, but had instead highlighted something very important. Unlike the stranger, Sophia had nothing, not even her clothes. Again. Wait, don't leave. He had barely managed to go more than 3 steps away from their adjacent stalls, but somehow, somewhat surprisingly stopped without hesitation, pausing in the mid-step and looking back at her with a questioning expression on his face, replacing the impassive one. Something about the stranger was unnerving, especially how her instincts for threats and potential marks was highly tuned, and he was giving off neither. Most women, even in provinces like Skyrim with the cultural norms of honour, needed to have some measure of awareness of the more dangerous elements of society, but this man wasn't triggering any of her highly experienced instincts in such matters, which was unusual, and niggled at her brain as she tried to not let her sudden, jittering nerves take over. I'm injured. Even for her usual lives, this was a terrible one, and with sleep releasing its grip and waking before a hangover could start to manifest, her mind was beginning to churn, seeing an opportunity in the situation ripe for exploitation. The stranger, however, seemed more amused and curious than concerned, even as she made a show of pressing her hand to her side under the blanket. Injured? Really? For a split second her instincts raised the hairs on her neck as she saw the shadows in his eyes and wondered whether her perception had been wrong. It was always a risky gamble feigning weakness around potential predators, but while she was completely naked between the hay-covered floor and the blanket, the one thing that she never lost, no matter how drunk, was laying by her side. Only the dead were unarmed in Skyrim these days. Yes, injured. What appeared to be true concern crossed his face for a moment as he seemed to study the way she was now sitting upright while wrapped in the blanket, and she gave a smile that she hoped that was partially alluring and partially that of someone in pain. The way that her head was throbbing, it wasn't too much of a sham. I need some help. You'll have to take me with you, otherwise I might die, and I'm sure you wouldn't want that on your conscience. Really? Cold brown eyes met hers, and he stared for a moment, as she did everything she could not to look away. There was something in his gaze that reminded her of the numerous veterans of the Great War as they were deep in their cups, and their minds took them back to bloodied fields almost 30 years before. You look all right to me. Yeah, well, that's because... Sighing, she rolled her eyes before meeting his gaze again. Okay, fine. I may have misplaced a few personal items, and if I walk out of here at the moment, I'm bound to cause a bit of a stir that the guards usually don't like. Did something happen to you? This was different, and not the sort of reaction that Sophia expected. This wasn't the first time that she'd woken up somewhere with no clothes on or anywhere nearby, and for a vast majority of Nords, finding a young, naked, 21-year-old brunette, let alone one of Sophia's attractiveness, was an opportunity. An opportunity that many had discovered also came with getting parts of their body cut open, or cut off if they tried the wrong thing. This reaction was one of legitimate concern, and unless the stranger was a Tamriel-class manipulator, he was actually genuine. As a Tamriel-class manipulator herself, she was quite confident she could identify one of her own kind. Nothing I didn't do to myself. I had a few drinks, had a bit of fun, found this place to sleep until you woke me, which I think you owe me for, by the way. Again, no real reaction besides taking another couple of steps towards her until he stood in the opened gate of the stall she occupied. She smiled as alluringly as she could. I'll be immensely grateful for any assistance. I owe you for waking you up. Don't you think that whatever clothes and the like I might provide will pay off that particular debt? If anything, it is going to leave you owing me favours instead. That's fine by me. I'll even make you a deal then. You help me out, and take me with you wherever you are going, and I'll make it worth your while. After all, you won't find anyone tougher or more amazing than me in all of Skyrim. Slowly, she leaned back, feeling the way that the blanket slid down far enough to reveal just enough of her favourite assets, not to mention as good-looking. Chapter 2. Hangovers and Hay. The chill that entered the stable had nothing to do with the morning breeze, and everything with the way his gaze hardened, and he didn't even glance downwards to her exposed chest. His eyes were firmly set on hers, as though he was trying and possibly succeeding in looking at who she really was. Most men, especially the Nords, were ridiculously easy to wrap around her little finger. A bat of an eye while biting a lip, swaying the hips a little while walking, and her all-time favourite of showing a bit of cleavage all worked wonders. Money, booze, and pleasurable company was the norm for her, and here she was, throwing almost her full arsenal at the stranger to get herself out of yet another self-inflicted predicament, with all the effectiveness of trying to breach Whiterun's walls with a sculptor's hammer. The stranger had nothing. There was none of the usual arousal or interest, just a careful glance that started at her eyes and studied her from top to bottom. His gaze was precise and controlled, working its way down her body and over her bare flesh to the rest still hidden under the blanket, but without even the slightest hint that he had noticed her nudity. What if I'm travelling beyond Whiterun? What if I was even leaving the province? That's fine by me. While still not covering herself, she continued to give him her best smile with all the confidence that she could muster. I'm not tied down anywhere, and I'm used to travelling around. I actually prefer it. Because of the travel, or because you get yourself into trouble at the places you stay at? Such a simple statement framed as a question was more wounding and concerning than if he had drawn his broadsword and cut her. It showed that he too was as just, if not more, of a better judge of character than she was. I suppose I could use someone to watch my back. Sophia was stunned. This was so unusual to her, especially his reactions, and she sat further upright, ignoring the way that the blanket fell further away and revealing more than just glimpses and hints of her body. Is that it? Aren't you going to flex your muscles and tell me how great you are? That you are a big, strong, independent man that doesn't need the help from a young, beautiful woman like me? You should know that that is practically the customary greeting in Skyrim. Flicking the ragged ponytail back over her shoulders, she shook out some of the hay that had managed to get tangled in its mass. Anyway, there's no suppose about it. Everyone could use someone a little more like me helping them out. Well, I suppose I could use someone like you. I was going to be staying in the city for a while, looking for work. But is there somewhere you would want me to take you? Nowhere in particular. I don't know, and I don't care. I'll just go wherever you are going. In return, I'll repay your kindness by fighting alongside you. Surely that's an offer you can't refuse. Probably not. Travelling by yourself in Skyrim these days is more dangerous than I expected. What happened to your clothes anyway? I have no idea. My memory is a little fuzzy. A few confirmatory glances around the stall confirmed the fact that wherever the rest of her possessions were, they certainly weren't nearby. I kept the important bits anyway. Still locked in its own scabbard, her Nordic short sword thudded into the top of the blanket in a puff of straw and dust as she drew it from where it was hidden, and she tried not to sigh to herself as she saw his eyes look at it more intently than her body. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered whether she had somehow encountered a eunuch, or whether all of his fun bits had been frozen off by Skyrim's notorious winters by the way he seemed more interested in her sword than its naked owner. At least he was earnest in his offer to help her, as his travelling pack thudded to the floor as well, and he started rummaging through its contents. A pair of heavy, hobnailed, cyrodiilic caligae were dropped into her lap, followed by the frayed and worn cloak from his shoulders. Of everything, the sandals were the most welcome, as while she had no issues with public nudity, walking around the streets without footwear was not an inviting prospect, despite the relative cleanliness of Whiterun. She was also extremely thankful that they seemed to be of Imperial Legion design, that, thankfully, came in two semi-adjustable sizes, too big and too small. Feet covered, or at least her soles covered from standing in whatever unmentionables lined the city streets, Sophia wrapped the cloak around herself experimentally for size, as its original owner continued to rummage through his personal items for anything useful. He had been watching her as she wrapped the lengthy strapping around her calves and ankles, and she couldn't help but grin at him and feel amused at how she was still completely naked, and no longer hidden under the acquired horse blanket. You don't need to keep staring at my body. Tossing her head back, she shifted slightly into one of her favourite poses that almost, but not quite, covered everything from view. It's like you've never seen a naked woman before. Again, there was nothing in his expression as his eyes met with her own. He had been staring, yes, but not at her body. He had been watching her, and not taking advantage of her nakedness. Somehow, the way he was able to ignore her state of undress and appearance and instead focus on looking for clothing or items of use was more unnerving than any lecherous behaviour. She was used to that, and found herself surprised at how she would have preferred it to the coldness he was radiating like the northern winters. Walking naked down the street didn't bother her. It had been something she'd done on numerous occasions and knew how to look after herself. Men wanting and lusting after her was one thing, but this was something different. Taking an obvious moment to consider his options, he sighed softly, reaching to his sides and tugging at the series of belts and straps keeping his breastplate firmly attached to his chest as he began pulling it off. So, why were you out here on your own? As he continued to strip out the few pieces of armour he wore, and, trying to ignore the weird sensation in her belly at his respectful indifference to her, Sophia picked up and rolled the cloak around in her hands. It was a Legion cloak, similar to all the others she had seen on the Legionnaires throughout Skyrim. But the colours were faded, the deep maroon turning into the colour of ancient rust or old blood, and the Imperial Dragon was a dark grey rather than a deep black. At a glance, it appeared old and perhaps salvaged, but the smell of fire and ash and the way it stained her fingertips told her otherwise. It was singed, burnt in places, and coated with the remains of fires only recently cooled in the previous days. The bottom portions especially had been burnt away, leaving it just over 2/3 of its original length, and the entire mass of cloth was rough to the touch. Am I not allowed out on my own? Finding the top of the cloak, she stared suspiciously at the mostly fresh bone that he had used to clasp it around the throat. It looked like a sharpened needle of a bone taken from a rabbit or some other small animal, and it was obvious he had used whatever materials he had at hand to repair his equipment's functionality. I had a bit to drink. So what? I guess I must have passed out. I hope it didn't cause too much trouble, Sophia continued, trying to work out the best way to wear the cloak so she could walk into Whiterun without being reacquainted with the interior of Dragonreach's dungeon. Actually, I'm not really that bothered. Almost without warning, and with his armour removed, he lifted his shirt up and over his head, becoming as bare-chested as she was before holding it out for her to take. For the first time, she was truly lost for words, stuck in place and staring at him almost unblinkingly as his flesh was revealed. Many, many veterans of the Great War between the Aldmeri Dominion and the Mede Empire could be found on every street in the holds, and most bore wounds of various severity. Even those few involved in the more recent rebellion between the Stormcloaks and the Empire were filtering their way throughout Skyrim, but Sophia had never seen anything like this. Before, while dressed in his long, rough-spun pants and tunic, his body had been covered from throat to wrist to the bottoms of his feet, and now some evidence of his life was revealed for her to see. There was barely a centimetre of skin that hadn't been ravaged by conflict, and every move he made bunched and twisted at the maze of damaged tissue. Burns overlapped gashes, and the kiss of blades sliced through the burns. There was no mistaking the fact that whoever he was somehow by far one of the strongest individuals she had ever laid eyes on, but also the most heavily injured by a huge margin. "Are you all right?" Shaking herself back into the real world, she tore her eyes away from the livid burn that started somewhere below his hip, beneath the woolen pants, and wrapped up and around his abdomen. It looked as though someone had covered a portion of his side in cooking oil before setting it ablaze. "Of course I'm all right. Don't start fussing over me. I'm more than capable of handling myself." So, if you are so tough and independent, then why do you need my help? The snort of amusement wasn't one born of disbelief, but was at least some sign of humour from him. Pulling on the shirt that smelled of male sweat and ash, she shook her hair free and watched as he leaned down to pick up his armour. There were blade cuts in his flesh that ran deep. One looked like it would have scoured the ribs under the puckered tissue, but it was a single gash amongst a forest of overgrown pain. Arms, chest, shoulders, and she could only guess there were more in his thighs and legs, the thought of which amused her, as she couldn't remember the last time she tried to imagine what lay underneath a man's pants that didn't involve interacting with those parts shortly after. I don't. Sophia paused again, as she realized that he had very few wounds on his back. Unlike the rest of his body, it was practically pristine, and a clear sign that whoever he was, he didn't believe in running away from his fights. Instead, I thought I would help you out. I didn't ask for any help, though. Pulling the leather straps tight despite the protests of their rusted buckles, he seemed genuinely curious as he rapped his knuckles on his breastplate, testing how it rested upon his bare torso. Scarred, strong, and perceptive. Normally, these would be the traits that Sophia would have admired or found extremely attractive, but not when she was attempting to get herself out of her latest mess. Kind and generous, too, especially given the fact that he was literally supplying the clothes off his own back for a complete stranger, which increased her unease proportionally to her finely attuned perceptions of a potential source of money, food, booze, and entertainment. Allura wasn't working, and was likely to annoy or otherwise insult him, so a different strategy was needed. Acting the part was easy enough. She had years of experience behind her, after all, and so she fidgeted, chewing her lip and making it appear as though she was trying to look everywhere but him. That part was surprisingly difficult, as the number and details of the scars on his body were sickeningly fascinating. Chapter 3 Whiterun. Well, to be perfectly honest, I was hoping that you would kind of keep me company. Taking an offered belt, she wrapped it around her waist, quickly realizing that it was several sizes too large to fit properly before tying the ends together into a knot. She wasn't overly tiny and knew that she had curves that other women would kill for, but his build and height meant that between the belt and his shirt she was practically wearing a dress of sorts. Look, I know it sounds weird, but it's no fun on my own. His lips curled in a half-smile and he grunted something that sounded very close to agreement as he rolled his shoulders, getting a feel for the way the armor sat without any underlying clothing. And what if I say no? What if I don't want to keep you company or keep you around? Again, the strange sensation crawling up her spine and into the pit of her belly gave her a brief pause. A very brief one, as those sorts of feelings and warnings were ones that if she ever acknowledged, it was waving to them, fading into her past. He was thinking of turning down her offer, her incredibly generous offer. This was unheard of, and she couldn't think of anyone who had ever turned down her company, whether it was for sharing drinks or more energetic pursuits that usually resulted in sleeping in a warm bed. Those pursuits usually also resulted in her acquisition of various coins and other collectibles, being liberated from their owners as well. Maybe he really was a eunuch. With the amount of scars and injuries, she was guessing that the chances he had received one in the parts that really matter was quite high, until proven otherwise. You can tell me to leave if you want, but surely you can at least give me a chance. The sensation of his eyes roaming over her body, dressed and covered as it was now in his cast-off pieces of clothing and wrapped in the smoke-smelling cloak, sent another chill up her spine. He wasn't looking at her appearance or attractiveness. He was looking at her arms, her legs, and overall build and judging her by those standards. Very, very unusual on its own, but his attention was more on her only remaining possession, the most. Her sword. I can't see the harm in it, he said after what felt like several hours, and Sophia released a tiny breath she didn't know she was holding as he stepped the closest he had ever been and offered her his hand. You do look like you can handle yourself. Grinning, she wrapped the singed cloak around her shoulders and fastened it with the bone needle. She had no pants, but the shirt that he had provided her hung down to mid-thigh and billowed around her. He mightn't have been as large as some of the Nords, but strength and confidence seemed to ooze out of him like a sweat. It was almost as though he knew that if the injuries he had received hadn't killed him, then nothing could, and eagerly she grasped his hand in one of her own and let him help her up. Whatever estimates she had for his strength, and even taking into account their differences in size, his hand was as unyielding as a bear trap as he gripped her firmly, but gently, and hauled her to her feet. In that single moment she felt as though High Hrothgar had reached down from the heights of the great mountain, and lifted her up like the wind, with a hand and forearm that felt as strong as granite. I haven't introduced myself, have I? Being close enough to reach out and touch left her looking up into his face, seeing the old, faded horizontal scar across his cheek under his right eye, and the way he seemed amused at her words. No, he chuckled, brown eyes looking into hers with something resembling real amusement appearing within them. You haven't. My name is Sophia. His proximity was powerful, especially now that his arms were entirely bare, with the exception of a pair of leather gloves and iron braces protecting his forearms. He looked like an archer, with powerful arms capable of drawing back the strongest of bows, but he obviously fought up close and personal like they currently were. But you probably already knew that. I'm Kaius. An eyebrow raised at her words once more, and taking a step back from her, he reached down, gathering his travelling bag and throwing it over his back. I'm somewhat new to Skyrim. Should I know you? Oh, certainly. I'm quite well known, although sometimes I'm not sure it's for the right reasons. A darkness crossed over his face at her words for a moment, but it wasn't directed at her. The far-off look in his eyes caused by her words hovered for a moment, until he seemed to almost physically crush it aside, the shadow on his soul being replaced with a confident half-smile. It was unsettling, but Sophia chose to ignore it as they both exited the stables, deciding that it surely must be related to the scars and injuries he had suffered in his life. Dawn had truly arrived, and with it the growing sights, sounds, and smells of a city awakening for the day. Traders and merchants were putting the finishing touches on their stalls, bakeries were preparing and arranging their fresh produce, and guards were scattered about, watching the growing crowds as they began their days. It was definitely several hours before Sophia's usual hour that she awoke, and the fresh, chilled air making its way up her impromptu shirt dress was proving to be very good at removing the last vestiges of sleep from her mind. Caius, however, appeared to ignore the way his arms were covered in a rolling wave of goose pimples from the breeze, striding along the road from the stables through Whiterun's solitary gatehouse. Whiterun was easily in Sophia's top 3 favourite cities in all of Skyrim. Wide open streets, colourful crowds, busy traders, and a climate that allowed one to forget or lose their clothes on a semi-regular basis without worrying about dying of hypothermia. Literally located in the heart of Skyrim, it was also the trade capital and centre of the entire province, where traders from the Eastern Stormcloak-held territories could meet in relative neutrality with their imperial-aligned cousins from the west. Such a place had always ensured a fresh influx of those easily lured by her wiles or relieved of their coin. It was one of the few cities in all of Skyrim, with perhaps the exception of the Lake City Riften, where someone such as her could live a comfortable life of drinking, fighting, and fucking to her heart's content. Despite her reputation, or indeed perhaps because of her new companion by her side, they weren't delayed or even considered by the city guards keeping a close eye on the city gates for smugglers and Khajiit caravan merchants. Whiterun was a city built and raised upon a lonely hill among the plains and tundras of central Skyrim, a proud fortress of warm hearths, and unlike the rest of the province, the civil war had left the hold untouched neutral ground. Beyond the occasional bandits, the city was safe and welcoming, which suited her just fine. It didn't take her long to take measure of Kaius, watching him out of the corner of her eye and attempting to gain some sort of purchase on who he was and how he thought for her advantage. As they made their way through the gatehouse, she watched how he practically prowled as he moved, his feet soft on the ground as though ready to burst into sudden violence or activity at a moment's notice. He also seemed to appear as though he was ignoring everything and everyone around them, but Sophia could tell that this was a ruse, or a mask. He watched, he listened, he took in the comings and goings, intently noting the way the crowds moved and grew in number as the morning dew was burned away from shingled roofs, but above all else he was quiet, content on listening to everyone around them, but also focusing on Sophia as she filled the silence between them with talk. I kind of see myself as an adventurer, although it's no fun without anyone to witness my heroic deeds as, despite waking up several hours before its usual arrival, Sophia could feel the hangover approaching and the way that it made her brain feel like it was coated in sand. Well, I'm sure there's probably something. I like to get drunk, kill stuff, and be a nuisance. There's always bounties in Whiterun, and the Jarl pays well for dealing with bandits. And bandits typically have booze, so that's always a win-win for me. What about you? I guess you can consider me a mercenary or a sellsword. But, to be honest, I'm more of a dayteller these days. Dirt or blood, it doesn't matter what stains my hands. Again, there were traces of something deeper under the confidence, something lurking just beneath the cold exterior, before Sophia mentally shrugged it away. I hope to be of some use to you, she continued, skirting around a small collection of red guards dressed in the traditional robes and hooded skullcaps of their homeland of Hammerfell, talking to one of the city guards. I am rather talented, if I say so myself, so I'm sure that there is something I can do for you. We'll have to wait and see, I guess. Kaius' smile was grim as he looked in the direction of the Bannered Mare Tavern as they entered the central market square. It was certainly the central hub of activity for the morning, and both of them shared glances at the dozens of stalls selling various foods and meals. Maybe later on you can show me just how well you can use that sword of yours, but I don't know about you, but I'm starving. We might have to work for our breakfast before we can address other matters. I wouldn't turn down a bottle of mead or two. Can't start the day without them, you know. And we can't hunt bandits in our condition. I barely have enough septums to rub together, let alone anything else. Besides, before you will be of any use to yourself or me, you'll need more in the way of clothes. His eyes turned to her, gave her another glance up and down with a mild look of curiosity, as though mentally determining her size for armour, without even the slightest element of desire infecting it. Especially armour. I definitely don't want anything to hurt my pretty face, she laughed, but felt a chill again as he looked about the city. For the first time in almost as long as she could remember, she felt confident in her short-term future at least. But there was something niggling away in the back of her mind, some deep-seated fear that she could not shake. Shrugging it away, she followed Kaius as he moved in the direction of the bounty board, where several dozen proclamations, letters, and job sheets were tacked and nailed. Her instincts were once again serving her well, bringing her to a man that, given time, could be wrapped around her little finger just like the dozens of others in her life. Unlike all the others, though, there was something more to Kaius. A true opportunity for longer-term gains. An opportunity that she was determined not to miss.